Picture this, a child born so strange that his own people didn't know what to make of him. Light skin when everyone around him had copper tones. Curly hair spiraling down instead of falling straight and black. They called him Curly, this odd boy born in 1840 to the Oglala Lakota, and overhead as he entered the world, a shooting star blazed across the Dakota sky. His father, a holy man who carried the name Crazy Horse, stood outside the birth lodge and watched that star streak through the darkness. And he knew, the way holy men sometimes know things, that this child would be different, that this child would matter. What none of them could know, standing there in that pre-dawn darkness, was just how much this strange boy would come to define the last 3 days of the Plains tribes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Young Curly grew up in a world that would seem utterly foreign to us now, but was sophisticated in ways that would surprise most modern Americans. The Oglala Lakota weren't wandering nomads scraping by in the wilderness. They were part of a thriving nation of roughly 10,000 people who followed an economic engine across the Great Plains. That engine was the buffalo. One buffalo, and think about this for a second, one buffalo provided about 2,000 pounds of usable material. Meat for food, obviously, but also hides for lodges and clothing, sinew for thread and bowstrings, bones for tools and sleds. Even the stomach made a perfect water container. The herds weren't just animals to these people. They were literally life itself, moving across grasslands that stretched farther than anyone could walk in a month. Curly's childhood was spent learning this life. How to ride before most kids today learn to ride a bicycle. How to track game by reading bent grass and disturbed earth. How to survive in country that could kill you with heat in summer or cold in winter. But he was always different. Quiet where other boys were loud. Thoughtful where they were impulsive. He watched more than he spoke, and the elders noticed this. His father noticed this. The boy had the makings of something special, though what that was remained unclear. Then came 1854, and everything changed. Curly was 13, old enough to understand what he was seeing, but young enough that it burned into him like a brand. A cow wandered away from a Mormon wagon train and into a Lakota camp. Some accounts say it was sick, others that it was just lost. Doesn't really matter. What matters is that a Miniconjou Lakota man killed it, and when the Mormons complained to the army, a lieutenant named John Grattan decided to make an example. 29 soldiers marched into a camp holding thousands of Lakota to arrest one man over one cow. Grattan was young, ambitious, and, here's the crucial part, absolutely convinced of his own superiority. He'd apparently told people he could ride through the entire Sioux nation with just 10 men. He was wrong. Spectacularly, fatally wrong. The confrontation went bad fast. Grattan ordered his men to fire. Chief Conquering Bear, who'd been trying to negotiate, took multiple bullets and died slowly over the next several days. And then the Lakota warriors, enraged at the murder of their chief, killed all 29 soldiers in minutes. Every single one. Grattan's body was found with 24 arrows in it, and here's the detail that matters. Young Curly watched this happen. He saw how quickly the soldiers died, how their weapons didn't save them, how their confidence evaporated into panic and then silence. He learned something that day that would shape the rest of his life. White soldiers weren't invincible. They bled and died like anyone else, but the real transformation came the following year. At 14, Curly went on his vision quest, the rite of passage that marked a boy's transition toward manhood. 4 days alone on a hilltop without food or water. 4 days of sun and wind and emptiness, pushing his body and mind to the edge of endurance, waiting for a vision that might or might not come. Some boys saw nothing. Some saw animals or natural phenomena. Curly saw himself riding through a storm on a horse that changed colors, bullets and arrows flying past him, but never touching him. Lightning marked his cheek. He wore no war bonnet, no paint, just a stone behind his ear and a hawk's feather in his hair. Behind him rode shadowy warriors trying to hold him back, his own people trying to restrain him. But he rode on through the storm, untouched. His father recognized this immediately as a thunder dream, one of the most powerful visions a warrior could receive. It meant his son would be a protector of the people, that he would walk a path no one else could walk. The vision came with instructions too. No war bonnet, no excessive paint. Don't keep anything for yourself. Give away your horses, your possessions. Live simply. And here's the part that made Curly so unusual among Plains warriors. He followed those instructions exactly. While other young men sought glory and status, counted coups, wore elaborate regalia, and bragged about their deeds, Curly did the opposite. He gave everything away. He refused honors. He didn't dance at victory celebrations. He just fought, and then he disappeared back into the camp like smoke. His best friend was a warrior named He-Dog, and together they began going on raids against traditional enemies, the Crow, the Shoshone. These weren't wars of extermination like the ones white Americans waged. They were more like deadly chess matches, tests of courage and skill, where stealing horses counted for more than killing men. But Curly approached even these traditional conflicts differently. Other warriors charged straight ahead. Curly would appear from an unexpected angle, strike fast, and vanish before anyone could organize a response. He studied terrain obsessively. He seemed to understand instinctively where his enemies would look and how to approach from where they weren't looking. The older warriors started calling him Crazy Horse, his father's name, because he fought like his visions, untouchable, unpredictable, like he existed partly in the spirit world. And then the white settlers started coming in numbers that boggled the mind. First in trickles through Lakota territory, heading for Oregon or California. Then in streams heading for Montana goldfields. These weren't warriors making traditional raids. This was something new, an entire civilization flowing westward. And Crazy Horse watched them with the same careful attention he'd learned as a boy. He studied their weaknesses. Supply lines stretching hundreds of miles, fear of night attacks, predictable routes following rivers and passes. He watched his uncle Red Cloud try diplomacy, attending councils, making speeches, all while secretly preparing for the war everyone knew was inevitable. Because the gold seekers and settlers kept coming, and they kept crossing Lakota land. And sooner or later the question would have to be answered with more than words. The buffalo herds were still enormous then, still darkening the plains like storm clouds made of flesh. But Crazy Horse, always watching, always thinking ahead, could see the future taking shape. He knew what was coming, even if he couldn't stop it. The storm from his vision was gathering, and soon he would have to ride into it. 1866. That's when everything exploded. The government decided to build a road straight through the heart of Lakota hunting grounds. The Bozeman Trail, they called it, a shortcut to the Montana goldfields. And not just a road, forts, 3 of them planted like flags on land the government had promised would remain Lakota forever. Red Cloud tried warning them, tried explaining that this was a violation of every treaty, every promise, every word spoken in council. The army built the forts anyway. Fort Reno, Fort Phil Kearny, Fort C.F. Smith, each one a deliberate insult, each one saying louder than words, "We don't care what we promised you." Red Cloud went to war. And Crazy Horse, now 26 years old, became the weapon Red Cloud wielded with devastating precision. Here's what made Crazy Horse so terrifying to the soldiers at these forts. He understood warfare as an economic problem. Every soldier stationed in Wyoming cost the government roughly $1,000 per year to supply. Food, ammunition, uniforms, equipment, all of it had to be hauled hundreds of miles by wagon train at enormous expense. The Lakota? They lived off the land for free. Every horse the warriors stole was one the army had to replace. Every wagon train they burned was supplies that had to be shipped again. Every woodcutting party they attacked was work that had to be redone under heavier guard. Crazy Horse turned the entire region around Fort Phil Kearny into an economic black hole that swallowed men and money with nothing to show for it. The fort's commander, Colonel Henry Carrington, was a builder, not a fighter. He'd been sent to construct fortifications, and that's what he focused on, building stockade walls while his men died one by one in the hills around him. Woodcutting parties needed armed escorts. Water details needed armed escorts. Men didn't walk 20 feet outside the fort walls without rifles, because Crazy Horse and his warriors owned everything beyond the sight of the sentries. Carrington kept precise records, and those records tell the story. Between August and December of 1866, his garrison lost 154 men killed, wounded, or captured. Think about that. In 4 months, he lost nearly a quarter of his command without fighting a single major battle. Just constant grinding attrition. Men vanishing, men found dead with arrows in them. Men who went out and never came back. The soldiers were terrified, and Crazy Horse knew it. Fear is a weapon as effective as any rifle, and he wielded it masterfully. Attack at dawn. Attack at noon. Attack at dusk. Never attack the same way twice. Never establish a pattern the soldiers could predict or prepare for. Keep them exhausted, keep them nervous, keep them making mistakes. And all the while, Crazy Horse was planning something bigger. Something that would end this once and for all. December 21st, 1866. The temperature was below zero. Snow covered the ground. Perfect conditions for what Crazy Horse had in mind. A young captain named William Fetterman was stationed at Fort Phil Kearny, and Fetterman had the same problem Grattan had 12 years earlier. He was absolutely convinced of his own superiority. He told people he could ride through the entire Sioux Nation with just 80 men. He was about to get his chance to try. That morning, a woodcutting party came under attack. This was routine. It happened almost daily. Carrington ordered Fetterman to relieve the wood train, but gave him explicit orders. Do not pursue beyond Lodge Trail Ridge. Stay in sight of the fort. Fetterman took 80 men, and a civilian named James Wheatley, who carried a 16-shot Henry rifle, the best weapon available at the time. 81 men total, riding out into the frozen morning. Crazy Horse was waiting with a small group of warriors, maybe 10 of them, acting as decoys. They attacked the wood train half-heartedly, then seemed to panic when Fetterman's soldiers approached. They ran, and Fetterman, seeing apparent easy targets, chased them. The young warriors played it perfectly, always staying just out of rifle range, always appearing to be on the verge of being caught, always leading the soldiers farther from the fort. One of those warriors was a young man named American Horse, and years later he described how nervous they were, how they had to keep checking over their shoulders to make sure Fetterman was still following, how their hands shook even though they were supposed to look terrified. Fetterman chased them over Lodge Trail Ridge, and there, hidden in the frozen grass and ravines, lay 2,000 warriors. Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Red Cloud had assembled the largest war party anyone could remember. They'd been lying there for hours in the snow, waiting, freezing, trusting that Crazy Horse's plan would work. It worked. The moment Fetterman's men crossed the ridge and couldn't see the fort anymore, the trap closed. 2,000 warriors rose from the grass and surrounded 81 soldiers in seconds. Fetterman tried to form his men into defensive positions, but the geography worked against him. The infantry formed a rough circle on a small rise, while the cavalry tried to reach them and got cut off. Wheatley and another civilian named George Fisher managed to barricade themselves behind some rocks and hold out longer than anyone else. They found dozens of spent cartridge cases around their bodies later, but eventually the sheer numbers overwhelmed them. And Crazy Horse led the charge that broke the infantry square. Multiple warriors who survived the battle remembered watching him ride straight into the soldiers' rifles, his horse dancing sideways through the bullets, exactly like his vision had shown him. He seemed untouchable. Men firing directly at him from 20 feet away somehow missed. The soldiers, already terrified by the screaming warriors pouring toward them from all directions, broke and ran. Once they broke, they died. In 40 minutes, every single soldier was dead. 81 men. Not one survivor, not one man who made it back to the fort to tell what happened. When the relief party finally reached the battlefield the next day, it was too late in the afternoon and too dangerous to go that first night. They found a scene that haunted them for the rest of their lives. Bodies stripped and mutilated in ways that reflected the rage the warriors felt. Fetterman and Captain Frederick Brown had apparently shot each other in the head rather than be captured. The Army's worst defeat on the plains, worse than anything that had come before, worse than anything that would come after, until Little Bighorn 10 years later. The victory accomplished exactly what Red Cloud wanted. The government couldn't sustain the economic cost of defending those forts, couldn't justify the casualties, couldn't explain to the public why soldiers kept dying in Wyoming when there were easier routes to Montana that didn't cross Lakota land. In 1868, 2 years after Fetterman's death, the Army abandoned all 3 forts. The Lakota burned them to the ground. Red Cloud signed a treaty that supposedly guaranteed the Black Hills and the Powder River country to the Lakota forever. It was the only time in American history that the United States government lost a war to Native Americans and admitted it by withdrawing. Crazy Horse should have been celebrating, should have been honored, praised, given every status marker a Plains warrior could receive. Instead, he made the worst mistake of his life, and it nearly destroyed everything. He fell in love with Black Buffalo Woman, wife of a warrior named No Water. And in Lakota society, that was complicated. Divorce existed. A woman could leave her husband, but the way Crazy Horse handled it violated every social norm. He eloped with her, just took her and ran. No Water, humiliated and enraged, tracked them down and shot Crazy Horse in the face. The bullet entered below his nose and exited through his jaw, leaving him scarred and lucky to be alive. Black Buffalo Woman went back to No Water. The tribe split into factions supporting each man, the whole society that had just won a war against. The United States nearly tore itself apart over this affair. Crazy Horse lost any chance of becoming a chief through traditional means. The incident marked him as someone who couldn't control himself, who put personal desire above the tribe's welfare. He eventually married a quiet woman named Black Shawl, who understood his nature, who didn't expect him to be normal or conventional. They had a daughter. They are afraid of her, and she was the only person who could make Crazy Horse smile, the only softness in a life growing harder by the year, because while the Lakota had won Red Cloud's war, they'd also awakened something they couldn't control. In 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, and it split the buffalo herds forever. The northern and southern herds, once numbering in the millions, were suddenly separated by steel rails and telegraph wires and the endless stream of locomotives. Commercial hunters began slaughtering buffalo by the hundreds of thousands, taking only the hides and leaving the meat to rot. General Philip Sheridan, commander of the Army's military division of the Missouri, openly encouraged this. He understood what Crazy Horse had always known. The buffalo were the economic foundation of Plains life. Kill the buffalo, and you kill the culture. Then came 1874, and gold was discovered in the Black Hills. Not just any gold, serious deposits that brought miners flooding into the sacred heart of Lakota cosmos. The Black Hills weren't just land to the Lakota. They were where spirits dwelled, where vision quests happened, where the sacred and earthly worlds touched. And now white men were tearing them apart, washing hillsides away with hydraulic hoses, leaving scars that would last forever. Red Cloud tried to negotiate. Other chiefs tried to compromise. Crazy Horse refused even to attend the meetings. His message was simple, direct, and uncompromising. One does not sell the earth upon which the people walk. He knew what was coming. Knew the government would use the Black Hills as an excuse for the final war. Knew that this time the army wouldn't stop until every Lakota was on a reservation or dead. And he prepared himself for that war with the same careful attention he'd brought to every battle, because the storm from his vision was here, and it was time to ride into it. Winter of 1875 to 76. The government issued an ultimatum that everyone knew was designed to be impossible. All Lakota must report to designated agencies by January 31st, or be considered hostile. Hostile meant The army could attack without warning, without negotiation, without mercy. The deadline came in the middle of the worst winter anyone could remember, with snow measured in feet and temperatures that killed exposed flesh in minutes. Even if the Lakota had wanted to comply, and most didn't, many couldn't have reached the agencies in time if they tried. Crazy Horse's response was to do exactly what the government feared most. He gathered with Sitting Bull, the Hunkpapa holy man whose spiritual power matched Crazy Horse's tactical genius, along the Rosebud and Little Bighorn rivers, and they weren't alone. Lakota from multiple bands came, Northern Cheyenne came, Arapaho came. Through that spring of 1876, the camps kept growing, lodges spreading along the river valleys in numbers no one had seen in living memory. By June, roughly, 7,000 people from 7 different tribes had assembled, the largest gathering of Plains Indians in history. 3 miles of lodges stretching along the Little Bighorn River, children playing the traditional games their grandparents had played, young couples courting, old people telling stories of when the world was young and full of buffalo. It wasn't a war camp, not really. It was a gathering, a celebration, a desperate attempt to live the old life one more time before that life vanished forever. But everyone knew the army was coming. 3 columns converging from 3 directions, nearly 3,000 soldiers. Total, planning to catch the tribes between them and crush them once and for all. General George Crook from the south, Colonel John Gibbon from the west, and from the east, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer with the 7th Cavalry. In early June, Sitting Bull performed the sun dance, the most sacred ceremony of Plains spirituality. For 3 days, he danced without food or water. His adopted brother cut 100 pieces of flesh from his arms, 50 from each, drops of blood marking the earth with each cut. On the 3rd day, Sitting Bull received a vision. Soldiers falling, upside down into the camp, their hats falling off, dead before they hit the ground. He interpreted this as a great victory coming, but with a warning. Take nothing from the dead soldiers, no weapons, no clothes, no trophies, or the victory would turn to dust. On June 17, 1876, Crazy Horse learned that Crook was approaching from the south, with over 1,000 soldiers and several hundred Crow and Shoshone scouts. The scouts were the real problem. They knew the country as well as the Lakota did and couldn't be fooled by the usual tactics. Crazy Horse gathered roughly 1,000 warriors and rode south to meet them at a place called the Rosebud. What followed was one of the strangest battles of the Indian Wars, 6 hours of fighting that ranged across miles of broken country. Warriors and soldiers chasing each other through ravines and over ridges. The lines of battle dissolving and reforming like smoke in wind. Crazy Horse was everywhere during that fight. Warriors who survived it described watching him rally men, lead charges, pull back to defensive positions, then charge again. The battle had no clear winner in the traditional sense. Both sides held the field at different times. Both sides took casualties. Both sides claimed victory afterward. But here's what mattered. At the end of the day, Crook retreated south and stopped advancing. He'd been fought to a standstill, and he knew he'd come very close to disaster. The 3-pronged strategy to trap the tribes had just lost 1 prong, and neither of the other 2 columns knew it yet. 8 days later, on June 25, 1876, a hot Sunday afternoon, everything came together in ways no one had planned and everyone would remember. George Armstrong Custer, 46 years old, Civil War hero, Indian fighter, ambitious and aggressive, approached the Little Bighorn Valley with 600 men of the 7th Cavalry. His scouts told him the village was enormous. Mitch Bouye, a mixed-race scout who knew the Plains tribes intimately, reportedly told Custer he'd never seen so many lodges in one place and they should wait for reinforcements. Custer ignored him. He'd built his reputation on aggressive action, on striking fast before enemies could escape, and he saw an opportunity for the kind of decisive victory that would make headlines back east. He divided his command into 3 groups. Captain Frederick Benteen took 125 men to scout to the left. Major Marcus Reno took 140 men to attack the village from the south. Custer himself took 210 men to attack from the north, planning to catch the village between Reno and himself in a classic pincer movement. On paper, against a village of what Army intelligence estimated at 800 warriors, it might have worked. But the intelligence was catastrophically wrong. The village held roughly 3,000 warriors, and every single one of them was about to learn that the army was attacking. Reno hit first, around 3 in the afternoon, his cavalry charging toward the southern end of the massive village. The first warriors to meet him tried to slow the attack, giving the women and children time to run to safety. But within minutes, hundreds of warriors poured out of the lodges, many only half-dressed, grabbing whatever weapons were closest. Crazy Horse was apparently in his lodge when the attack started. He painted his face with the sacred designs from his vision, tied a stone behind his ear and a hawk feather in his hair, then mounted his pinto horse and rode toward the sound of gunfire. What Reno's men saw coming toward them must have been absolutely terrifying. Not dozens of warriors, not hundreds, thousands. Crazy Horse led a countercharge that hit Reno's cavalry line like a hammer striking glass. The soldiers, who'd been advancing confidently moments before, suddenly found themselves fighting for their lives against numbers they couldn't count. Reno's line wavered, broke, and then collapsed into panicked retreat. The cavalry fled back across the Little Bighorn River, scrambling up bluffs on the far side, leaving dead and wounded behind. In 20 minutes, Reno lost 40% of his command, 18 dead, 16 wounded, numerous missing. His attack had failed completely, and now those warriors turned their attention north, where Custer was about to learn what Reno had just discovered. Custer's 210 men on the ridgeline above the village faced a tactical nightmare. They could see the enormous village now, could see the scale of their mistake, but they were committed. The warriors who'd driven off Reno came boiling up from the south. More warriors emerged from the village itself, crossing the river and climbing the slopes. And Crazy Horse, reading the battlefield with the same tactical genius that had defeated Fetterman and stalled Crook, led several hundred warriors up a ravine that was invisible from Custer's position. Emerging on the north side, where the soldiers weren't looking, Gall, a hunk-papa war leader, attacked from the south, croaking from the west, and Crazy Horse from the north, exactly like his vision, riding through the storm untouched. The soldiers tried to form defensive positions, but the terrain worked against them. The ground was too open, too exposed, and there were too many warriors coming from too many directions. Some soldiers tried to hold a position on what's now called Custer Hill. Others tried to reach the river. None of it worked. The warriors had overwhelming numbers, intimate knowledge of the ground, and the fury of people defending their families. The end came in waves of chaos and violence that survivors from both sides would struggle to describe coherently for the rest of their lives. But at approximately 5:30 in the afternoon, the last of Custer's men fell. 210 soldiers dead in under an hour, 16 officers, and 194 enlisted men. The army's worst defeat on the plains, worse even than Fetterman. And for exactly 60 seconds, maybe less, the combined tribes held absolute military superiority. Think about what that moment represented. 3,000 warriors had just destroyed an entire cavalry command. The nearest army reinforcement was Reno's demoralized survivors 2 miles away. The next nearest was Crook's column, which had retreated after the Rosebud fight. The army had 10 forts scattered across the region: Fort Abraham Lincoln, Fort Ellis, Fort Shaw, Fort Laramie, Fort Robinson, Fort Fetterman, Fort D.A. Russell, Fort Fred Steele, Fort Sanders, Fort Bridger, but none of them knew what had just happened. The telegraph wires hadn't carried the news yet. In that brief window, the tribes held total victory. The women moved among the bodies, looking for wounded warriors to save and enemy wounded to kill. They found Custer near the top of the hill, 2 bullet wounds, one in the temple, one in the heart. The Lakota and Cheyenne women recognized him as the leader, and perhaps respecting his courage in dying with his men rather than running, didn't mutilate his body the way they did many of the others. He'd fought and died like a warrior, and they honored that even in victory. But even as the women worked and the warriors caught their breath and began to realize the magnitude of what they'd accomplished, those 60 seconds were ticking away. Riders were already racing toward the telegraph stations. The modern world's communications network was about to activate, and once it did, everything would change. Within hours, the news would reach the nearest forts. Within days, newspapers from New York to San Francisco would scream the headlines. Within weeks, Congress would authorize 2,500 new cavalry soldiers and invalidate every treaty the government had signed with the Lakota. Crazy Horse knew this. That evening, sitting with his friend He-Dog, he reportedly said, "This is a good day to die, for all the things of our life are gone." He understood what many warriors celebrating the victory didn't, that they'd just signed their own death warrant. The tribes had won the battle, but in winning it, they'd guaranteed they would lose the war. The American government might tolerate military setbacks on its frontier, might negotiate with tribes it considered troublesome, but it would never accept the total destruction of an army command. The full weight of American industrial power was about to come down on the Plains tribes, and no amount of tactical genius or spiritual power could stop what was coming. The 60 seconds of triumph had triggered an avalanche, and Crazy Horse could see it beginning to fall. The winter of 1876 to 77 became known among the Lakota as the Starving Time. The great village at Little Bighorn scattered within days of the battle, the different tribes splitting up into smaller bands that could move faster and find game more easily. They knew what was coming. The entire United States Army was coming, and staying together in one massive village just made them an easier target. Crazy Horse led his band back toward the Powder River country, the hunting grounds his people had fought so hard to keep. But even there, safety was an illusion. General Nelson Miles pursued them relentlessly, not in the traditional summer campaign style where armies rested during winter. Miles came after them through blizzards and 40-below temperatures, his soldiers wrapped in buffalo coats, pushing through snow that killed horses. The strategy wasn't to fight a pitched battle. The strategy was to make life impossible. Attack winter camps, burn lodges, destroy food supplies, capture horses, force constant movement that prevented hunting, prevented rest, prevented the normal rhythms of survival that Plains life depended on. Mile after mile, week after week, never letting up. In November, Colonel Ranald Mackenzie destroyed Dull Knife's Cheyenne village in a dawn attack that killed 40 warriors and captured 700 ponies. The survivors staggered through the snow to find refuge with Crazy Horse's band, arriving with frost-bitten feet and children crying from hunger and cold. Crazy Horse took them in, sharing what little his people had, but the mathematics were brutal. More mouths to feed, less food available. The buffalo had vanished, not scattered, vanished. The commercial hunters working from the railroad had slaughtered them by the hundreds of thousands. Estimates suggest that between 1870 and 1875, hunters killed over 4 million buffalo on the southern plains alone. The northern herd was going the same way. Where Crazy Horse's people had once found buffalo within a day's ride, now they could search for weeks and find nothing. By spring of 1877, Crazy Horse's band was eating their horses. Then they ate their dogs. Then they stripped bark from cottonwood trees and boiled it into a bitter mush that barely kept people alive. Children cried constantly from hunger. Old people began the death songs, preparing to walk into the snow so their younger relatives would have more food. Warriors who'd fought at the Rosebud and Little Bighorn sat in lodges too weak to stand. And still Miles kept coming, his scouts finding every camp, his soldiers attacking before Crazy Horse's people could rest. Then came the blow that broke something inside Crazy Horse. His daughter. They are afraid of her, got sick with cholera. She was maybe 3 years old, the only person who could make him smile, the only softness in a life that had become nothing but fighting and fleeing. He watched her die slowly, unable to help, unable to do anything except sit beside her and sing while she slipped away. After she died, people noticed the change in him. The fierce intensity that had driven him became something darker, something that looked a lot like despair. On May 6, 1877, Crazy Horse led 900 people into Fort Robinson, Nebraska. Not prisoners, surrendered. There's a difference, and that difference mattered. He rode at the head of the column, warriors singing death songs, women keening, the whole procession a funeral for a way of life. When he reached the fort, he dismounted and handed his Winchester rifle to the officer in charge. Then he handed over his war pony. But he kept his war shirt, the one marked with the symbols from his vision. He kept that because surrendering the shirt would have meant surrendering himself completely, and that he would not do. General Crook, the same man Crazy Horse had fought at the Rosebud, made promises. An agency in the Powder River country where Crazy Horse's people could live in their traditional territory. Freedom to hunt, respect for their ways. If Crazy Horse would help the army fight the Nez Perce, another tribe refusing to go to a reservation, Crook would see to it personally. Crazy Horse apparently agreed, not understanding, or perhaps not caring, that these were promises Crook had no authority to make and no intention of keeping. The government had already decided that all Lakota would be consolidated onto the Great Sioux Reservation in South Dakota. And what Crazy Horse wanted didn't matter. At Fort Robinson, the politics turned poisonous fast. Red Cloud, who'd surrendered years earlier and now held status as an agency chief, saw Crazy Horse as a threat to his power. Other agency chiefs resented the attention Crazy Horse received from army officers who wanted to meet the legendary warrior, wanted to hear stories about the Fetterman fight and Little Bighorn. Young warriors still looked to Crazy Horse for leadership, and that made him dangerous to anyone trying to maintain control through cooperation with the whites. The interpreters made everything worse. Frank Rouard, a mixed-race scout who'd lived with the Lakota but now worked for the army, deliberately mistranslated Crazy Horse's words during councils. When army officers asked if Crazy Horse would help fight the Nez Perce, he apparently said something like, "I will fight until not one. Ne Perce remains hostile, Rouard." Translated it as, "I will fight until not one white man remains." The paranoia that followed that mistranslation convinced the army that Crazy Horse was planning an uprising, planning to kill officers, planning to escape back to the Powder River with young warriors who still believed in the old ways. On September 5th, 1877, soldiers came to arrest Crazy Horse and take him to the guardhouse. He went with them initially, perhaps not understanding, perhaps too broken by his daughter's death to care anymore. But when they reached the guardhouse and he saw the barred windows, saw the cells where Apache prisoners were kept, he understood. This wasn't protective custody. This was prison. This was chains. This was everything his vision had shown him he would never accept. He tried to pull away. Little Big Man, who'd fought beside him at the Rosebud and Little Bighorn, who'd been a warrior when warriors mattered, grabbed Crazy Horse's arms and held them. The betrayal of that moment, a fellow warrior restraining him while white soldiers closed in, must have been worse than any bullet. Crazy Horse pulled a knife, slashing at Little Big Man's wrist, trying to break free. In the chaos of struggling bodies, Private William Gentles drove his bayonet into Crazy Horse's lower back. The blade puncturing his kidney, they carried him to the adjutant's office and laid him on the floor. His father, the old holy man who'd given him his name and interpreted his vision, came and sat beside him. His mother came keening the death song. Touch the Clouds, a Miniconjou chief who stood nearly 7 feet tall, kept watch to make sure the soldiers didn't disturb them. Through the evening, Crazy Horse lay dying, blood pooling beneath him, his breathing growing shallower. At midnight, he spoke his last words to his father. "Tell the people it is no use to depend on me anymore." Then he died. 36 years old, never photographed, never signed a treaty, never wore chains. In death, he achieved what he'd wanted in life, to remain free. The army let his parents take his body. They wrapped him in a red blanket, placed him on a travois, and disappeared into the darkness. Where they buried him, they never told anyone. Various locations have been suggested over the years: a canyon in the Black Hills, a spot along Wounded Knee Creek, a hidden place only his family knew. The exact location remains unknown to this day, and that's fitting somehow. Even in death, Crazy Horse couldn't be captured, couldn't be claimed, couldn't be put in a museum or marked with a government monument. Within a decade of his death, the world he'd fought for vanished completely. The buffalo were essentially extinct, fewer than 1,000 animals surviving from herds that had numbered in the millions. The Lakota were confined to reservations, their hunting grounds open to white settlement, their children forcibly taken to boarding schools where teachers cut their hair and beat them for speaking Lakota. The policy was explicit: kill the Indian, save the man, erase the culture, erase the language, erase everything that made them who they were. But they couldn't erase Crazy Horse. They couldn't erase what he represented. The stories survived. The old people told them to their grandchildren in whispered Lakota, and those grandchildren told their children, and the memory of the warrior who never surrendered, who gave everything away, who rode into battle like he was riding through a dream, lived on. He became more than a man. He became a symbol of resistance, of living according to your vision even when the whole world tells you to compromise, of choosing death over surrender because some things matter more than survival. Today, they're carving his face into a mountain in the Black Hills, Crazy Horse Memorial. They call it, and there's bitter irony in that, the man who refused to be photographed, who gave away all his possessions, who wanted nothing but to live free on the land, is being turned into a tourist attraction carved into the sacred hills he died trying to protect. But maybe that's fitting too. Maybe it shows that even in a world that tried to erase him, tried to forget him, tried to reduce him to a footnote in the story of American expansion, Crazy Horse remains. Still free, still riding through the Black Hills in dreams and stories. The warrior who chose death over chains, the last free man of the plains.